Before it was called Argentina, it was land shaped by silence, vast grasslands, cold winds, and rivers that moved like whispers of destiny. The native peoples, the Guarani, the Diaguita, the Mapuche, and others, had lived in harmony with these lands for centuries. They saw the earth as living, and the rivers as sacred veins that connected all creation. But the winds began to carry new sails. In 1516, an explorer named Juan Diaz de Solis arrived on the shores of what he would call the Rio de la Plata, the River of Silver. He came searching for treasure, but Allah had written something deeper. His arrival marked the beginning of European eyes falling upon this land, and with them came greed, ambition, and prophecy. Solis never left alive. The local peoples met his intrusion with resistance, and he was killed near the river's mouth. Yet, as history would show, when Allah decrees a chapter to unfold, even the deaths of men become sentences in his book. Decades later, explorers under Pedro de Mendoza returned in 1536 to establish Buenos Aires. Hunger, conflict, and disease struck them, forcing their retreat. Still, they returned again, as if drawn by fate. Until, by the late 1500s, Spain had claimed the land as part of its empire. Argentina, before it became Argentina, was already a battleground between those who walked in remembrance of creation and those who sought to possess it, the soil that would one day hold Black, Indigenous, and European footsteps had already been sanctified by struggle. By the 16th century, the Spanish Empire had stretched its hand across oceans, searching for gold, spices, and glory. But in truth, they were moving according to what Allah had already written, stepping upon lands that had been resting in silence since the beginning of time. They named it La Plata, believing its rivers flowed with silver. They saw light and thought it meant wealth. But in that same light, Allah had hidden signs that no matter what men built, the earth would always testify to who truly belongs to it. Spain's conquest spread slowly. They built settlements along the Paraná and Uruguay rivers, connecting what would become Buenos Aires, Córdoba, and Santa Fe. But life here was not easy. The soil refused to be tamed. The people resisted, and nature itself seemed to rebel against their greed. When they could not find enough labor, they began to look beyond the ocean, toward Africa. Ships that once carried explorers now carried souls. Buenos Aires became a quiet port for the enslaved, its churches ringing bells while its markets sold flesh. And so the story of Argentina, before independence, before nationhood, was already written in the collision of three worlds. The indigenous who remembered the earth, the Africans who carried the remembrance of God, and the Europeans who thought they could control both. But Allah never abandons His creation. Even in the darkness of empire, He allowed light to move quietly, in the songs, the prayers, and the endurance of those who remembered Him in silence. As the Spanish colonies grew, the demand for labor deepened. Sugar plantations, cattle ranches, and the building of new towns all required hands that the colonizers refused to use their own for. So they turned their ships toward Africa. The first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans to Argentina began around the late 1500s, carried through the port of Buenos Aires. Many came through the larger slave ports of Brazil and Montevideo, before being smuggled or traded into the region, known then as the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. Men, women, and children were brought from West and Central Africa, from the lands of Senegambia, Angola, Congo, and Mozambique. Among them were Muslims who whispered Bismillah as they stepped onto the docks, believing even this exile was written. Some were from the Mandinga, Wolof, and Hausa peoples, names that would later become Mandinga or Mina in local speech. They labored in the fields of Tucumán, the estancias of Córdoba, and the streets of Buenos Aires, where their songs, languages, and rhythms began to blend with the Spanish tongue. In the silence of bondage, they carried remembrance. In the rhythm of their feet, they carried prayer. Over time, the Black population became a visible part of Argentina's life. Soldiers, artisans, cooks, builders, midwives. Yet despite their presence, they were written out of the story. Their faces built the foundations of Buenos Aires, but history chose not to look. Still, Allah looked, and the angels wrote every sigh, every tear, every unspoken prayer that came from the hearts of those who longed for freedom. When the cry for freedom echoed across South America in the early 1800s, it was not only the criollos, the white descendants of Spaniards, who answered. It was also the men and women who had long known chains. From Buenos Aires to Salta, Black Argentines took up arms in the wars of independence. Some fought for the promise of liberty. Others were promised manumission, freedom in exchange for their lives. Many never returned home, but their courage became the unseen spine of Argentina's revolution. Among them was María Remedios del Valle, often called La Madre de la Patria, the mother of the nation. Once enslaved, she joined the army of General Manuel Belgrano, tending to the wounded, feeding soldiers, and fighting in battle. She was captured, whipped, and left for dead, yet survived and returned to the field again. Years later, when the wars ended, she was forgotten, begging in the streets until the government finally recognized her service. Her faith and resilience made her a living reminder that Allah raises those whom society tries to erase. There were also men like Antonio Ruiz, known as Falucho, an Afro-Argentine soldier who fought under General José de San Martín in the wars across Chile and Peru. When asked to betray the flag he fought for, he refused, shouting, "Viva Buenos Aires," long live Buenos Aires, before being executed. His name became a symbol of loyalty, though history often failed to mention the color of his skin. Thousands of unnamed Africans and their descendants filled the ranks of San Martín's armies, forming entire Black battalions such as the Regimiento de Castas, the Batallón de los Pardos y Morenos, and the Granaderos de Cuyo. They carried weapons in one hand and faith in the other. Some whispered of God before battle. Others traced the memory of their ancestors in the soil beneath their feet. By the end of the wars, many of these men were gone, not because they lacked courage, but because they were placed on the front lines, fighting in the most dangerous positions. Argentina gained independence, but the people who fought hardest for its birth were buried under silence. Though many had long lost the ability to openly worship, some carried quiet traces of the old remembrance. The rhythm of prayer in their breath, the calm submission to destiny, the dignity of those who once said there is one God. Even if their tongues were silenced, Allah still heard their hearts. And though they did not fight in His name, their story remains part of His decree, proof that even in the farthest corners of oppression, He watches, He records, and He redeems. When Argentina declared independence in 1816, freedom came at a cost that was unevenly carried. The new nation wanted to be seen as modern, European, and pure. In their pursuit of a white identity, they turned their eyes away from the very people who had made their freedom possible. The wars of independence had already consumed thousands of Black lives, most of them placed on the front lines, promised liberty for service they would never live to see. Those who returned found little change. Their labor was still cheap, their names still unspoken, their faces still unseen. Then came disease and deliberate policy. The yellow fever epidemic of 1871 struck Buenos Aires hardest in the poorest neighborhoods, the same neighborhoods where Afro-Argentines lived. Thousands died, their loss dismissed as a tragic coincidence. But the truth ran deeper. Even before the epidemic, their communities had been shrinking through neglect, poverty, and war. Government census records began to edit them out. By the late 19th century, Argentina claimed itself a white nation. Officials stopped counting Afro-descendants, and the word Negro was slowly erased from demographic categories. European immigrants arrived by the millions, from Italy, Spain, and Germany, and the black presence that once filled Buenos Aires was treated as if it never existed. But Allah erases nothing that He has written. The blood of those who once walked these streets still lives in the veins of their descendants, in the features of families who no longer know their origin, in the rhythm of the candombe drums that still echo through old neighborhoods, and in the heartbeat of the tango, born from African and Creole fusion. Every beat, every dance, every melody that moves through Argentina carries a whisper of those who were silenced. They are the unseen verses of the nation. And even if the world forgot their names, Allah did not. Though Argentina tried to erase its black population, the sound of truth cannot be silenced. What the world called music or folk tradition were often the after echoes of prayers once spoken in another tongue. The tango, now Argentina's national dance, began not in the elegant halls of Buenos Aires, but in its poorest corners, among freed blacks, Creoles, and immigrants. Its rhythm carries the heartbeat of candombe, a dance and drum tradition that came from the Congo and Angola. The African drums that once called upon ancestors later called dancers to gather. The rhythm never died. It simply changed its language. In the words and slang of Argentine Spanish, traces of African presence remain. Mandinga, a word once used to describe African Muslims of Mande origin, became a term whispered with both fear and fascination, meaning something mystical, powerful, or otherworldly. Quilombo, today meaning chaos, originally referred to African-run villages of escaped slaves, communities of freedom that resisted colonial order. The language carried memory even when people did not. And in certain old families, quiet stories persist of ancestors who washed before prayer, faced the east to speak to the sky, or buried their dead with reverence for the unseen. Though the Quran was lost to their hands, its rhythm remained in their hearts. It is said that when Allah wills remembrance, He plants it in places no empire can reach. Argentina became one of those places where faith hid beneath rhythm and history folded itself beneath silence. And perhaps this too was by decree, that the forgotten would not stay forgotten, that centuries later their story would return, not through conquerors or historians, but through the awakening of hearts that still recognize Allah's hand moving through time. Every nation writes its own story, but only Allah holds the truth of it. Argentina wrote itself as white, European, modern, distant from Africa and Islam, but beneath that surface lies another chapter, one that never stopped breathing. For every enslaved man who whispered Bismillah beneath his breath, for every woman who washed her hands before she cooked, for every drumbeat that carried the rhythm of remembrance, Allah wrote their names, even when men refused to. History tried to bury them under silence, epidemics, and ink. But Allah says in the Quran, "And we bring the dead to life, and we write down what they have sent before and their traces, and all things we have kept in a clear record." Their traces are the proof, living in sound, in spirit, in language, in the blood of those who still walk Argentina's streets today without knowing whose heartbeat they carry. The land remembers, the rivers remember, and the angels never stopped writing. So this, too, becomes part of the story of the people of the book. Not just the revealed scripture, but the living book Allah writes through history itself. Each continent, each generation, each forgotten people is a line in that divine manuscript. Argentina's page was not erased, only covered, and now, by His will, it is being read again.